Hiya, going to read a bit more Skellig. We're probably halfway through now. Mrs. Dando was on the phone, said Dad, on the way to the hospital. She was asking about you. That's nice. She said your mates want you back. I'll see them Sunday. Not missing school then? I shrugged. Don't know. Maybe you could go back soon, eh? Don't want to miss out on too much. I learn a lot from Mina. She knows about lots of things like birds and evolution. Well, there's that, and of course, you've learned the Chinese menu off by heart. At the hospital, the baby was still in the glass case, but the wires and tubes weren't in her. Mum lifted the lid back, and I held the baby on my knee. I tried to feel if she was getting bigger and stronger. She squirmed, and I felt the long, thin muscles in her back as she stretched. She took my finger in her fist and tried to squeeze it tight. She opened her eyes wide. Look, said Dad, she's smiling at you. But it didn't seem like a smile to me. A doctor came to see us, Dr. Bloom. She's coming on then, said Dad. Flying, said the doctor. We'll have her back soon. Dr. Bloom shrugged. He touched the baby's cheek. We'll need to keep an eye on her, he said. A few days, maybe. He smiled at me. Try not to worry, lad, he said. I touched the baby's shoulder blades, felt how tiny and flexible they were. I felt the thin rattle of her breath. She'll be running in the garden soon, Mum said. She laughed, but there were tears in her eyes. She took the baby from me and rubbed cream on my skin again. You look tired, she said. She looked at Dad. You two been staying up too late? Dead right we have, said Dad. It's been videos and Chinese takeaways all night every night, hasn't it, son? I nodded. Yes, it has. I went out into the corridor. I asked a nurse if she knew where the people with arthritis went. She said lots of them went to Ward 34 on the top floor. She said she thought that was a silly place to put people with bad bones who had such trouble walking and climbing stairs. I jumped into a lift and went up. I stepped out of the lift and a woman came past me pushing a Zimmer frame. She rested, puffing and grinning. Knackered, she panted. Once up and down the ward and 3 times round the landing. Absolutely knackered. She leaned on the frame and looked me in the eye. But I'll be dancing soon. Her hands were twisted and her knuckles were swollen. Arthritis, I said. That's right, Arthur. But I've got 2 new hips and I'll be dancing soon, and that'll show him who's the boss for a while at least. I've got a friend with arthritis, I said. Poor soul. What'll help him? Well, Arthur usually ends up winning in the end, but in the meantime, some folks swear by cod liver oil and a positive mind. For me, it's prayers to Our Lady and Dr. McNabola with his scissors and his saw and his plastic bits and his pieces and his glue. She winked at me. Keep on moving, that's the thing. Keep the old bones moving. Don't let everything seize up. She shuffled on, humming Lord of the Dance. I followed the signs to Ward 34. I looked inside. There were dozens of beds facing each other across the room. There were people practicing moving on Zimmer frames. Some lay in bed, smiling and knitting, wincing as they called across the ward to each other. Some lay exhausted, filled with pain. At the far end, a cluster of doctors and students in white coats gathered around a man in black. He spoke, and they scribbled in notebooks. He strode through the ward, and they followed. He pointed at patients, and they nodded and waved. He stopped at several of the beds and smiled for a moment as he listened to the patients. He shook hands with a nurse and headed quickly for the door. I stood there as the cluster approached me. Excuse me, I said. The man in black strode on. Dr. McNabola, I said. He stopped and looked down at me. The doctors and students came to halt around me. What's good for arthritis? I said. He blinked and grinned. The needle, he said. He pretended to squeeze a giant syringe. Deep injections, right into the joint. He winced, pretending to be in pain, and the doctors and students sniggered. Then the saw, he said. He made sawing movements with his arm. and he gasped and twisted his face in agony. "Bits cut out and new bits put in," he said. He pretended to thread a needle, then to sew. "Stitch it up, good as new," he said. He sighed with relief, as if all his pain had gone. He leaned towards me. "Are you a sufferer, young man?" I shook my head. "A friend." The doctor stood up very straight. "Then tell your friend to come to me. I'll needle him, saw him, fix him up, and send him home nearly as good as new." The doctors sniggered again. "Failing that," he said, "the advice is simple. Keep cheerful. Don't give up. Most of all, remain active. Take cod liver oil. Don't allow those joints to grind to a halt." He clasped his hands behind his back. "Anything else?" I shook my head. He looked at the doctors, around me. "Any other advice for the young man's friend?" They shook their heads. "Then let us carry on," he said, and he strode into the corridor. I stood there thinking. "You looking for someone?" said a nurse. "No," she smiled. "He's a good doctor, really," she said, "but he does like to show off. You tell your friend, keep moving, and try to smile. Don't make it easy for Arthur." I ran back to the lift and back to the baby's ward. Mum and Dad were sitting holding hands, gazing down at the baby. "Hello," said Mum. She tried to smile, but her voice was flat and I could see she'd been crying. "Hello. You've been a while." "All those Chinese takeaways," said Dad, trying to get us to laugh. "Cod liver oil," she said. "That'll sort you out." She held me tight. "You're my best boy," she whispered. "Whatever happens, you'll always be my best boy." At home, as Dad prepared to get started again in the front room, I took a bottle of brown ale from the fridge and hid it with my torch just inside the garage door. I got my Swiss Army knife from my room. I took a handful of cod liver oil capsules from the bathroom and I put them in my pocket. I asked if it was okay if I went to see Mina again. "Don't worry about me," said Dad. "I'll do all the dirty work. You just run around and have a good time." Her blanket and books were still on the lawn, but she wasn't there. I looked up into the tree, and she wasn't there. I stepped over the wall, went to her front door, rang the doorbell. Her mother came. "Is Mina in?" I asked. She had jet black hair like Mina's. She wore an apron covered in daubs of paint and clay. "She is," she said. She put her hand out. "You must be Michael. I'm Mrs. McKee." I shook her hand. "Mina!" she shouted. "How's the baby?" she asked. "Very well. Well, we think she'll be very well." "Babies are stubborn things, strugglers and fighters. Tell your parents I'm thinking of them." "I will." Mina came to the door. She had a paint-splashed apron on too. "We're modelling," she said. "Come and see." She led us through to the kitchen. There were big balls of clay in plastic bags on the table. The table was covered in a plastic sheet. There were knives and wooden tools. Mina's book of bird drawings was open at the blackbird. She showed me the clay she was working with. It was just a lump, but I could see the outline of a bird, a broad body, a pointed beak, a flattened tail. She added more clay and pinched the body and began to draw out its wings. "Mina's fixated on birds just now," said Mrs. McKee. "Sometimes it's things that swim, sometimes it's things that slink through the night, sometimes it's things that creep and crawl, but just now it's things that fly." I looked around. There was a shelf full of clay models: foxes, fish, lizards, hedgehogs, little mice, then an owl with its great round head, its pointed beak, its fierce claws. "Did you make those?" I asked. Mina laughed. "They're brilliant," I said. She showed me how the clay would be shaped if the bird were in flight, how she could mark the feathers in with a pointed knife. "Once it's fired and glazed, I'll hang it from the ceiling." I picked up a piece of clay, rubbed it between my fingers, rolled it between my palms. It was cold and grainy. Mina licked her finger, rubbed the clay, showed how it could be made shiny smooth. I watched her, copied her. I worked the clay again, drew it into the shape of a snake, pushed it all together again, and made the shape of a human head. I thought of the baby. I started to shape her thin, delicate form, her arms and legs, her head. "Like magic, eh?" said Mina. "Like magic, yes. Sometimes I dream I make them so real they walk away or fly out of my hands. Do you use clay at school?" "We do sometimes. We did in one class I was in." "Michael could come and work with us sometimes," said Mina. Mrs. McKee looked at me. Her eyes were as piercing as Mina's, but more gentle. "He could," she said. "I've told him what we think of schools," said Mina. Mrs. McKee laughed. "And I've told him about William Blake." I went on making the baby. I tried to form the features of her face. The clay started to dry out in the heat of my fingers. It started to crumble. I caught Mina's eye. I tried to tell her with my eyes that we had to go. "Can I go for a walk with Michael?" she said immediately. "Yes. Wrap your clay in plastic and you can get on with it when you come back." I led her quickly along the front street. Then I turned into the back lane. I led her past the high back garden walls. "Where are we going?" she said. "Not far." I looked at her yellow top and blue jeans. "The place is filthy," I said, "and it's dangerous." She buttoned the blouse to her throat. She clenched her fists. "Good," she said. "Keep going, Michael." I opened our back garden gate. "Here?" she said. She stared at me. Yes. I stood at the garage door with her. She peered into the gloom. I picked up the beer and the torch. "We'll need these," I said. I took the capsules from my pocket. "And these as well." Her eyes narrowed and she looked right into me. "Trust me," I said. I hesitated. "It's not just that it's dangerous," I said. "I'm worried that you won't see what I think I see." She took my hand and squeezed it. "I'll see whatever's there," she whispered. "Take me in." I switched on the torch and stepped inside. Things scratched and scuttled across the floor. I felt Mina tremble. Her palms began to sweat. I held her hand tight. "It's all right," I said. "Just keep close to me." We squeezed between the rubbish and the broken furniture. Cobwebs snapped on our clothes and skin. Dead blue bottles attached themselves to us. The ceiling creaked and dust fell from the rotten timbers. As we approached the tea chests, I started to shake. Maybe Mina would see nothing. Maybe I'd been wrong all along. Maybe dreams and truth were just a useless muddle in my mind. I leaned forward, shone the light into the gap behind the tea chests. "Again," he squeaked. I heard Mina stifle a cry. I felt her hands stiffen. I pulled her closer. "It's all right," I whispered. "I brought my friend," I said. "Like I said I would. This is Mina." He turned his eyes towards her, then lowered them again. I showed him the brown ale. "I brought this as well." He laughed, but he didn't smile. I squeezed through to him. I snapped the cap off the bottle with the opener on the knife and crouched beside him. He tipped his head back and let me pour some of the beer into his mouth. He swallowed. Some of it trickled from his mouth onto his black suit. "Nectar," he sighed. "Drink of the gods." He tipped his head back again, and I poured again. I looked back at Mina's dark form looking down at us, her pale face, her mouth open and eyes gaping in astonishment. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Mister had enough of you," he squeaked. "I saw a doctor," I said. "Not Dr. Death, one that could fix you." "No doctors, nobody, nothing. Let me be." "You'll die. You'll crumble away and die." "Crumble, crumble." He tipped his head back. "More beer." I poured more beer. "I bought these as well," I said. I held out cod liver oil capsules to him. "Some people swear by them," I said. He sniffed. "Stink of fish," he squeaked. "Slimy, slithery, swimming things." There were tears in my eyes. He just sits here, I said. He doesn't care. It's like he's waiting to die. I don't know what to do. Do nothing, he squeaked. He closed his eyes and lowered his head. Mina came in beside us. She crouched, stared at his face as dry and pale as plaster, at the dead blue bottles and cobwebs, at the spiders and beetles that scuttled across him. She took the torch from me. She shone it on his thin body in the dark suit, on the long legs stretched out on the floor, on the swollen hands that rested at his side. She picked up one of the dark furry balls from beside him. Who are you? She whispered. Nobody. She reached out and touched his cheek. Dry and cold, she whispered. How long have you been here? Long enough. Are you dead? He groaned. Kids' questions. Always the same. Tell her things, I said. She's clever. She'll know what to do. He laughed, but he didn't smile. Let me see her, he said. Mina turned the torch to her face, and it was brilliant white with pitch-dark gaps where her mouth and eyes were. I'm called Mina, she said. She sighed. I'm Mina, she said. You're Mina, he said. I'm sick to death. She touched his hands. She lifted his filthy cuff and touched his scrawny, twisted wrists. Calcification, she said, the process by which the bone hardens, becomes inflexible, the process by which the body turns to stone. Not as stupid as she looks, he squeaked. It is linked to another process, she said, by which the mind too becomes inflexible. It stops thinking and imagining. It becomes hard as bone. It's no longer a mind. It's a lump of bone wrapped in a wall of stone. This process is ossification. He sighed. More beer, he said. I poured more beer into his mouth. Take her away, he whispered. The roof trembled in the breeze. Dust fell on us. Mina and I crouched close together, our knees almost resting on him. She twisted her face as she caught the stench of his breath. I took her hand and guided it to his shoulder blades. I pressed her fingertips across the bulge beneath his jacket. She leaned across him, felt his other shoulder blade. When she looked at me, her eyes in the torchlight were shining bright. Her face was almost touching his. Their pale skin bloomed in the torchlight. What are you? She whispered. No answer. He sat there with his head lowered, his eyes closed. We can help you, she whispered. No answer. I felt the tears running from my eyes. There's somewhere we could take you, said Mina. It's safer there. Nobody would know. You could just sit there, dying too, if that's what you really want. Something brushed past us. I shone the torch down, saw Whisper entering the space behind the tea chests. Whisper, said Mina. The cat moved to his side, pressed itself against his damaged hands. He sighed. Smooth and soft, he whispered. His knuckles moved against the cat's soft fur. Sweet thing, he whispered. Whisper purred. The timbers creaked. Dust fell on us again. Please let us take you somewhere else, I said. More beer, he whispered. I held out a cod liver oil capsule. Take one of these as well, I said. He tipped his head back. I poured the beer in. I dropped the capsule onto his pale tongue. He opened his eyes. He looked deep into Mina. She looked deep into him. You must let us help you, she said. He was silent for a long time. Do what you want, he sighed. Okay, more to come later.